why some people seem cold, distant, or emotionally unavailable, yet somehow never truly let you go. One day they pull away, disappear, or act like they do not care, and the next, you realize they still watch you quietly, remember small details about you, or return when you least expect it. According to the deeper ideas behind Carl Jung and modern attachment psychology, avoidants often hide love in the exact place most people never think to look, behind emotional distance. But here is the strange part. When an avoidant truly loves someone deeply, their behavior starts changing in subtle but powerful ways that almost nobody notices until it is too late. In this video, we are going to uncover the hidden signs that reveal when an avoidant secretly wants you in their life forever, why they fear emotional closeness even when they love deeply, and the one behavior that exposes feelings they struggle to say out loud. Stay until the end, because the final sign is the one most people completely misunderstand. One of the most confusing things about people with avoidant attachment tendencies is that they often appear emotionally detached on the outside while carrying incredibly deep emotional connections internally for years, sometimes even decades. This contradiction is exactly why so many people feel lost after loving an avoidant, because the avoidant rarely expresses love in obvious ways. They may not chase, beg, constantly text, or fight dramatically to keep someone close, and because of that, many assume the feelings were never real. But in many cases, the opposite is true. The avoidant mind is built around emotional self-protection. Deep intimacy can feel overwhelming because closeness unconsciously triggers fear of losing independence, fear of vulnerability, fear of rejection, or even fear of being fully seen. So when emotions become intense, avoidants often do something paradoxical. Instead of moving closer, they create distance. To the other person, it looks cold, confusing, or uncaring, but internally, the avoidant may be experiencing emotional chaos they do not know how to regulate. This is why many avoidants disappear physically while remaining emotionally attached psychologically. They cope by suppressing feelings rather than expressing them. And suppression is not the same as absence. In fact, suppressed emotions often last longer because they are never fully processed. This is one reason avoidants may quietly think about a person long after the relationship ends, replay conversations in their mind, revisit memories privately, or compare future partners to the one connection that affected them deeply. According to the ideas associated with Carl Jung, whatever is pushed into the unconscious does not disappear. It continues influencing behavior beneath the surface. Avoidants often bury emotional dependency because they want to believe they are fully self-sufficient, but the unconscious attachment remains active in subtle ways. That is why an avoidant may suddenly reconnect months or years later, not because the feelings randomly returned, but because they never completely left. What makes this dynamic even more complicated is that avoidants often show attachment indirectly rather than openly. Instead of saying, "I miss you," they may quietly monitor your life from a distance, remember tiny details about you long after others forget, keep gifts or messages hidden away, or emotionally freeze whenever they see you moving on. Many avoidants are deeply loyal internally, even when they struggle to maintain emotional closeness externally. And this creates the painful paradox. They can love deeply while simultaneously struggling to behave in ways that make love feel secure to another person. But it is also important not to romanticize this behavior. Emotional attachment alone does not automatically create a healthy relationship. Someone can care deeply and still lack the emotional tools needed for consistency, communication, or vulnerability. This is why understanding avoidance requires looking beyond surface behavior. Their silence is not always indifference. Their distance is not always freedom, and their lack of chasing is not always proof they never cared. Many avoidants were conditioned, consciously or unconsciously, to associate emotional dependence with danger, weakness, or loss of control. So instead of running toward love the way anxious people often do, they run from the intensity of what they feel. Yet ironically, the connections that scare them the most are often the ones they carry the longest. One of the most misunderstood aspects of avoidant attachment is what can be called silent loyalty, which is the quiet, almost invisible way some people continue to hold emotional space for someone even when they are not actively present in their life. To most people, love is measured through words, attention, consistency in communication, or emotional openness. But for individuals with avoidant tendencies, expression often happens in far more indirect and subtle forms. Instead of saying what they feel, they tend to show it through behavior that does not immediately look like affection on the surface. For example, an avoidant person may rarely initiate conversations, but they might still check your social media quietly, remember specific details about your life that you once mentioned in passing, or show up again after long periods of silence, as if no time has passed emotionally for them. This is not always a strategic game or manipulation. More often, it is a reflection of how they process emotional connection internally rather than externally. For them, emotional closeness can feel overwhelming or even destabilizing, so they regulate it by stepping back physically while still maintaining internal attachment. This is where the idea of silent loyalty becomes important. The bond is not expressed through constant interaction, but through persistence in memory and emotional imprint. From the perspective associated with Carl Jung, experiences that strongly affect the psyche do not simply disappear, they sink into the unconscious and continue influencing thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in subtle ways. This can explain why some avoidant individuals seem to return emotionally even after long absences. Not because they were actively thinking about reconnecting every day, but because the emotional imprint of the connection never fully dissolved. Silent loyalty can also appear in the way they compare new relationships to past ones, often without consciously realizing it, or how certain people remain emotionally unique in their memory even if they no longer communicate. However, it is important to understand that this form of loyalty is not the same as healthy emotional availability. A person can remember you deeply, feel connected to you internally, and still struggle to show up consistently in a relationship. That gap between feeling and expression is where confusion usually arises. Many people misinterpret distance as indifference, but in some avoidant patterns, distance is actually a coping mechanism to prevent emotional overload. So when people talk about silent loyalty, they are really describing a hidden layer of attachment that exists beneath avoidance, where love is not loudly declared but quietly stored. The challenge is that this type of connection often lacks clarity, reassurance, and stability, which are essential for healthy relationships. Understanding this paradox helps make sense of why some avoidants seem emotionally gone on the surface, yet never fully emotionally disappear in the long run. The idea of shadow love is not a formal term used by Carl Jung himself, but it connects closely to his concept of the shadow, which refers to the parts of the psyche that we reject, suppress, or refuse to consciously acknowledge. In relationships, especially for people with avoidant tendencies, the shadow often contains emotions like neediness, dependency, fear of abandonment, and even deep longing for intimacy. These are not feelings that disappear just because someone ignores them. Instead, they are pushed out of awareness because they feel unsafe, overwhelming, or incompatible with the person's self-image of independence and control. This is where the idea of shadow love becomes useful, as a way to describe what happens beneath the surface. Love that is deeply felt but not consciously accepted or expressed in a direct way. For avoidance, emotional closeness can trigger an internal conflict. On one side, there is genuine affection and attachment. On the other side, there is fear of losing autonomy, fear of being emotionally exposed, or fear of being hurt. Rather than integrating these opposing forces, the avoidant psyche often chooses suppression as a defense mechanism. So instead of saying, "I need you" or "I miss you," the feeling gets buried into the shadow and expressed indirectly through distance, silence, or emotional withdrawal. But Jung's perspective suggests that what is pushed into the shadow does not simply vanish. It continues to influence behavior from behind the scenes. This is why someone can appear detached while still being emotionally activated by a specific person or memory. In the context of relationships, shadow love can show up as contradictions. Pulling away while still thinking about the person constantly, acting indifferent while feeling emotionally stirred, or ending a relationship while still carrying an internal attachment that was never fully processed. The more a person tries to suppress vulnerability, the more power that vulnerability holds in the unconscious. This creates a psychological tension where love becomes something hidden rather than expressed, almost like an emotional undercurrent that never fully surfaces. Avoidants are often not unaware of their feelings. Rather, they are aware but uncomfortable with what those feelings demand in terms of closeness, dependency, or emotional exposure. So instead of integrating love in a balanced way, they compartmentalize it into the shadow, where it can exist without threatening their sense of control. The irony is that this suppression does not eliminate attachment. It often intensifies it in indirect forms, because what is not expressed openly tends to persist internally. Understanding shadow dynamics helps explain why some avoidants seem emotionally distant yet still deeply affected by certain people long after the connection ends. However, it is also important to recognize that awareness of shadow patterns is the first step toward change. When a person begins to acknowledge and integrate these hidden emotions, rather than suppress them, they become capable of forming relationships that are not driven by fear, but by conscious choice and emotional balance. When someone with avoidant tendencies lets you see their weakness, it is often one of the most significant emotional signals they can give. Because for them, vulnerability is not a casual act. It is something carefully controlled, delayed, and usually avoided unless trust has reached a very deep level. According to the attachment patterns studied in modern psychology, avoidant individuals are typically wired to maintain emotional independence as a form of safety, meaning they often grow up learning, consciously or unconsciously, that relying on others can lead to disappointment, loss of control, or emotional overwhelm. As a result, they become highly skilled at presenting a composed, self-sufficient exterior, even when they are experiencing intense internal emotions. This is why emotional exposure becomes such a rare and meaningful event in their relationships. When an avoidant allows someone to see their fear, uncertainty, sadness, or need for reassurance, it means their usual defense system is temporarily lowered, and that does not happen easily or frequently. It is not about dramatic confession or constant emotional openness. In fact, it is often the small, subtle moments that matter most, like admitting they had a hard day, showing uncertainty in their decisions, or expressing discomfort with something personal instead of withdrawing or shutting down. These moments signal that the person feels safe enough, at least in that instance, to step outside their protective emotional structure. From the perspective of Carl Jung, this can be understood as a brief integration of the persona and the shadow, where the carefully constructed outer identity, strong, independent, unaffected, temporarily relaxes enough for deeper, less controlled emotions to surface. That intersection is often uncomfortable for avoidants, because vulnerability creates a sense of emotional exposure that they are not used to regulating in real time. This is also why they may quickly retreat after such moments. They might feel exposed or emotionally too seen, even if the experience was meaningful. However, the key insight here is that avoidants do not typically reveal their weaknesses to just anyone. Emotional openness tends to occur selectively, often with someone who has already bypassed many of their usual distancing patterns. This is why such moments can indicate profound attachment rather than casual trust. It is not simply that they are sharing a feeling. It is that they are temporarily choosing connection over protection. Still, it is important to understand this in a balanced way. Emotional exposure alone does not guarantee long-term consistency, commitment, or relational security. An avoidant can care deeply and still struggle with sustained vulnerability, which means these moments should be seen as indicators of emotional depth, not automatic proof of readiness for stable intimacy. What makes them meaningful, however, is that they reveal what is usually hidden. Behind the distance, there is often a capacity for attachment that is real but carefully guarded. One of the most emotionally confusing patterns in relationships is when someone seems deeply connected one moment, and then suddenly pulls away right after things feel intense, intimate, or meaningful. For people with avoidant attachment tendencies, this shift is not random or playful. It is often a protective psychological response to emotional overload. When connection becomes too close, too fast, or too emotionally charged, it can activate an internal alarm system that associates intimacy with loss of control, vulnerability, or even potential emotional danger. So instead of moving closer when feelings intensify, the avoidant nervous system often does the opposite. It creates distance to restore a sense of stability and autonomy. This is why the timing feels so painful and confusing for the other person. Just when emotional closeness seems established, the avoidant suddenly becomes quieter, less available, or emotionally inconsistent. On the surface, it can look like disinterest or manipulation, but internally it is often a regulation strategy rather than a rejection of the person. The intensity of emotional connection can create a paradox for avoidants. They genuinely feel something meaningful, but the feeling itself becomes overwhelming because it challenges their deeply rooted need for independence and emotional control. As a result, they unconsciously deactivate their attachment system by stepping back, focusing on logic over emotion, or minimizing the significance of what just happened. From a psychological lens influenced by Carl Jung, this can be seen as a conflict between conscious desire and unconscious fear. The conscious mind may experience attraction, connection, or even love, while the unconscious reacts to intimacy as something that threatens psychological balance. When these two forces collide, the avoidant psyche often resolves the tension by retreating, because distance feels safer than emotional exposure. This does not necessarily mean the connection was not real. in many cases, it means it was real enough to trigger a defense response. Another important layer is that avoidants often struggle to tolerate dependency, both their own and someone else's dependency on them. Intense connection naturally creates a sense of emotional responsibility and interdependence, which can feel unfamiliar or burdensome. So pulling away becomes a way to reestablish emotional independence and reduce internal pressure. However, this pattern creates a cycle that is painful for both sides. Closeness leads to withdrawal, distance creates longing, and longing eventually pulls them back in again. Understanding this cycle helps explain why avoidants can seem inconsistent, not because they lack feeling, but because they are constantly balancing between connection and self-protection. One of the most confusing behaviors in relationships with avoidant individuals is the way they seem to test emotional safety without ever directly saying what they are looking for. Instead of asking questions or expressing fears openly, they often rely on indirect behaviors like distancing, delayed replies, emotional unpredictability, or even temporary disappearing acts. To the other person, these actions can feel inconsistent or hurtful, but psychologically, they often function as unconscious protection mechanisms rather than intentional games. For someone with avoidant attachment tendencies, emotional closeness can feel both desirable and threatening at the same time. They may genuinely want connection, but they also fear losing autonomy, being overwhelmed, or becoming emotionally dependent. Because of this internal conflict, they rarely move straight toward trust. Instead, they test it indirectly to see whether the connection remains stable even when they withdraw. For example, when they delay responses or become emotionally quiet, they are not always trying to push the other person away permanently. In many cases, they are observing what happens next. Does the other person become anxious? Do they chase? Do they respect space? Or does the connection remain steady without pressure? These reactions unconsciously help the avoidant assess whether emotional safety exists in the relationship. From the perspective associated with Carl Jung, this can be understood as a form of projection and unconscious relational testing, where internal fears about abandonment or engulfment are externalized through behavior rather than communicated directly. Instead of saying, "I am afraid of getting too close," the avoidant psyche creates distance and observes the emotional outcome. If the other person reacts with panic, pressure, or emotional escalation, it can reinforce the avoidant's belief that closeness is unsafe or destabilizing. But if the other person remains calm, grounded, and non-reactive, it can create a subtle sense of safety that encourages re-engagement. Emotional unpredictability in this context is not always intentional manipulation. More often, it is a nervous system trying to regulate closeness in a way that feels manageable. Avoidants often do not fully trust emotional intensity, so they rely on space as a way to recalibrate their internal state. However, this creates a push-pull dynamic where the other person feels confused, uncertain, or emotionally destabilized. The disappearing acts in particular are often misunderstood. While they can feel like rejection, they are frequently moments where the avoidant is trying to regain emotional equilibrium, not necessarily end the connection. The problem is that this method of testing safety is indirect and unclear, which can lead to misunderstandings and emotional distress on both sides. Ultimately, what avoidants are often searching for is not perfection, but consistency in emotional response, a sense that closeness does not automatically lead to pressure, loss of freedom, or emotional overwhelm. When they encounter that kind of stability, their defenses can gradually soften. But until then, their way of checking emotional safety remains indirect, fragmented, and often difficult to interpret from the outside. There is a very specific moment in relationships with avoidant individuals that often goes unnoticed on the surface, but internally it can feel like a quiet psychological shift they cannot easily ignore. It is not a grand confession, not a sudden romantic realization, and not something they usually express out loud. Instead, it often happens when they begin to notice that their emotional state is no longer fully under their control when it comes to one particular person. For someone with avoidant attachment tendencies, the experience of deep love is rarely recognized as love right away. It is first experienced as disruption. They may notice that they are thinking about the person more than they intended, feeling emotionally affected by their presence or absence, or reacting more strongly than they are comfortable with. This is often the point where emotional independence starts to feel slightly compromised, and that sensation can be both powerful and unsettling at the same time. The moment they realize they are deeply attached is usually not when everything feels perfect, but when distance starts to hurt more than expected. For example, They may feel a strange discomfort when the other person becomes less available, or they may notice a sense of emotional emptiness when communication slows down. These feelings are important because avoidants are typically skilled at minimizing emotional dependency. So when dependency begins to emerge naturally, it becomes impossible to fully ignore. From a psychological perspective influenced by Carl Jung, this can be seen as a moment where unconscious material starts to surface into conscious awareness. The attachment that was previously kept in the background begins to enter the foreground of the psyche, challenging the avoidant's self-image of independence and emotional control. This is often when internal conflict intensifies. One part of them wants closeness and connection, while another part immediately reacts with caution, fear, or the urge to pull away. The realization of deep love is rarely peaceful for avoidants. It is often accompanied by resistance because it threatens their internal balance. They may start rationalizing their feelings, downplaying the importance of the connection, or focusing on perceived flaws in the relationship as a way to regain emotional distance. However, despite this resistance, there is often a moment of clarity where they recognize that this person has become emotionally significant in a way that cannot easily be reversed. It may not be labeled as love immediately, but it shows up as attachment, emotional dependence, or a fear of losing access to someone who now feels important to their inner world. Ironically, this realization often does not lead to immediate closeness. Instead, it can trigger withdrawal, because the intensity of the feeling itself becomes overwhelming. Yet even in withdrawal, the emotional imprint remains. This is why some avoidants return later, not because they suddenly discovered feelings, but because they finally stopped avoiding what they already felt. From a Jungian perspective, the reason some people seem to stay in an avoidant person's memory forever is not about romance alone, but about emotional imprinting at a deeper psychological level that touches the unconscious mind. In the ideas associated with Carl Jung, experiences that carry strong emotional charge do not simply fade with time. Instead, they become part of the psyche's inner structure, stored not just as memory, but as emotionally active material that can resurface in thoughts, dreams, or emotional reactions long after the external relationship has ended. For avoidant individuals, this becomes even more significant because they tend to suppress emotional expression rather than fully processing it. When emotions are not openly expressed or resolved, they do not disappear. They are pushed into the unconscious, where they remain psychologically alive in a different form. This is why certain people can leave a lasting imprint, not necessarily because of how long the relationship lasted, but because of how intensely it was felt beneath the surface. In many cases, avoidants experience deep emotional moments internally while simultaneously maintaining outward distance. That combination creates a paradox. The emotional experience is strong enough to be remembered, but not fully integrated through expression or closure. As a result, the memory remains charged rather than neutralized. Jung would describe this as an interaction between conscious control and unconscious retention, where what is not fully acknowledged by the conscious mind continues to exist in the background of the psyche, influencing perception and emotional associations over time. This can explain why avoidants may unexpectedly recall certain people in very specific emotional states, or why memories of particular relationships feel more vivid compared to others that were more stable but less emotionally intense. Emotional intensity plays a key role here, because the psyche tends to remember what disrupts its equilibrium. When a relationship challenges an avoidant sense of independence or emotional control, it often creates a strong internal imprint, even if outward behavior suggests detachment. Over time, the conscious mind may move on, but the unconscious retains the emotional signature of the experience. This is not necessarily about longing in a straightforward sense, but about psychological resonance. Certain people become symbolic within the inner world of the individual, representing moments of vulnerability, connection, or emotional awakening that were never fully integrated. Another important aspect is that avoidants often process emotions in delayed or fragmented ways. What was suppressed during the relationship may resurface later when the emotional defenses are lower, or when life circumstances trigger reflection. This is why some memories do not feel static. They feel alive, as if they still carry emotional weight. In Jungian terms, this reflects the idea that the unconscious continues to work on unresolved emotional material long after the conscious mind believes it has moved on. Ultimately, people who are remembered forever in this context are not just remembered for who they were externally, but for what they activated internally. They become part of the psychological landscape of the individual, woven into the deeper layers of memory, emotion, and identity in a way that does not easily dissolve with time or distance. The truth is, most people assume avoidants are all the same: distant, inconsistent, emotionally unavailable. But that's where they get it wrong, because there are actually two completely different patterns hiding behind the same behavior. And if you learn to spot the difference, you'll understand whether someone is just passing through your life or quietly keeping you in their long-term emotional world. An avoidant who simply likes you will feel warm in moments, but inconsistent in presence. They may enjoy your company, respond when it's convenient, and show bursts of interest, but there is no emotional structure behind it. Their connection stays in the present moment. When you are not there, their emotional system resets quickly. There is curiosity, attraction, maybe even affection, but it does not turn into emotional dependency or long-term psychological imprinting. They can let go without much internal conflict because the attachment never fully deepens into emotional vulnerability. But an avoidant who is secretly planning a future with you behaves very differently under the surface. They may look even more distant at times, even more confusing, but internally, something is changing. You start to become part of their mental landscape, not just their present experience. They begin observing you more than reacting to you. They remember details you forgot you ever shared. They withdraw, but they do not detach. And most importantly, they start returning, not randomly, but cyclically, as if something keeps pulling them back. From a psychological lens influenced by Carl Jung, this difference can be understood as the gap between surface-level attraction and deep unconscious imprinting. One stays in the conscious mind and fades easily. The other sinks into the unconscious, where it continues to influence emotions, memory, and decision-making even during distance. And here's the most important distinction. An avoidant who only likes you can leave and feel free. But an avoidant who is deeply attached may leave and still not feel finished, because for them, distance is not always an ending. Sometimes, it is where attachment becomes strongest. And if you know what signs to look for, you'll start to see which one you're really dealing with, before it's too late. There is a moment in relationships with avoidant individuals that feels almost unnoticeable at first, but in psychological terms, it is one of the rarest shifts that can happen in their emotional world. It is the moment when they stop running. Not physically, not dramatically, but internally. The constant urge to create distance, to reduce intensity, to escape emotional pressure begins to soften. For someone with avoidant attachment tendencies, emotional closeness is often processed as something that requires caution, because intimacy has historically been linked with overwhelm, loss of control, or emotional discomfort. So their natural response is to regulate closeness by stepping back, creating space, or emotionally detaching when things feel too intense. But when they stop doing this, even temporarily, it signals that something in their internal system has changed. It means the connection is no longer being interpreted as a threat to their emotional independence. Instead, it is being experienced as something safe enough to stay present in. This shift is not triggered by intensity alone, but by consistency, a kind of emotional reliability that does not demand, pressure, or destabilize them. When an avoidant begins to feel that they do not have to protect themselves from emotional engulfment, their defenses slowly start to relax. From the perspective associated with Carl Jung, this can be understood as a gradual integration of previously conflicting inner forces, where the need for connection and the need for autonomy are no longer in constant opposition. Instead of one overwhelming the other, they begin to coexist in a more balanced way. This is what makes the moment so rare. It is not just about finding the right person, but about experiencing a level of emotional safety that rewrites an internal pattern built over years. When avoidants feel safe enough, they do not lose their independence. They stop needing to defend it so aggressively. And that is when something subtle but powerful begins to happen. They stay present longer, they open up in small but meaningful ways, and they no longer treat closeness as something they must escape. However, this transformation does not happen through force, persuasion, or emotional intensity. In fact, those often push them further away. It happens through stability, patience, and a consistent emotional environment that does not punish vulnerability or demand immediate closeness. When that kind of safety is finally experienced, the avoidant nervous system begins to recalibrate. And for many of them, it is the first time closeness stops feeling like danger and starts feeling like connection. That is why when an avoidant truly stops running, it is not just a behavioral change, it is a psychological shift. It means they have encountered something rare enough to override their defenses. Emotional safety that feels real enough to stay for.